Adam opened his eyes to the persistent rustling of leaves overhead. Sunlight pierced the canopy in sharp, golden beams, warming the skin on his face. He pushed himself up from the ground, feeling the new, rhythmic pulse of his own muscles. He stood, his feet sinking into the soft, damp moss of the forest floor. The garden felt vast and alive. He walked forward, his stride steady, and reached for a branch hanging low near his shoulder. He plucked a bright, heavy fruit and bit into the skin. The juice was cold, sweet, and sharp, flooding his senses with a clarity that seemed to match the stillness of the air. He tasted the earth in the fruit, a deep and clean flavor that grounded him to the soil beneath his feet. He took another step, breathing in the scent of damp bark and crushed greenery. Everything moved in a slow, perfect cycle of growth and light. There was no resistance in the world, only the soft give of the grass and the steady, golden warmth of the sun as it tracked across the sky. The rhythm of the garden changed as he walked. The low hum of insects faded, replaced by a rhythmic, crashing sound ahead. Adam pushed through a dense thicket of ferns, the leaves brushing against his legs with a soft hiss. The air grew cooler, mist clinging to his skin. He stepped into a wide clearing where a waterfall spilled over dark stone, turning the light into a shimmering veil of spray. Standing by the edge of the pool, watching the water churn, was Hawa. She did not turn at the sound of his approach, yet she seemed to know he was there. Adam stopped, the roar of the water filling the space between them. He took a single step closer. The tension in his limbs softened, yielding to a sense of recognition that felt as old as the earth itself. Hawa turned, her gaze meeting his, and the weight of the silence vanished. She reached out, her fingers finding his hand. The contact was solid, warm, and absolute. They stood together in the mist, the waterfall casting rainbows across their skin, bonded by a stillness that made the entire garden feel complete. They moved together through the grove, their path winding toward the center of the garden. The trees grew taller here, their branches weaving into a dense, protective roof that filtered the sunlight into a soft, golden haze. As they broke through a curtain of hanging vines, they found it. A single tree stood in the middle of a wide, circular clearing. Unlike the others, its bark shimmered with a pale, metallic luster, and the fruit hanging from its boughs pulsed with a rhythmic, inner light. The glow ebbed and flowed, casting long, shifting shadows across the grass. Adam and Hawa stepped closer, drawn by the hypnotic rhythm of the light. The air grew heavy, static electricity prickling against their skin. Just as Hawa reached out to touch a low-hanging branch, the atmosphere shattered. A deep, resonant voice filled the entire clearing, vibrating through the ground and into their very bones. "Do not eat from this tree." The command was absolute, leaving no room for question. They froze, the sound echoing in the sudden, suffocating silence that followed. They bowed their heads, the warmth of the garden replaced by a sudden, sharp cold, and turned away from the light to retreat back into the forest. Days settled into a rhythm of gentle exploration. Adam and Hawa moved through the groves, their feet finding familiar trails under the thick canopy. They gathered fruit from the low branches, the juice cool and sweet against their tongues. The garden remained a place of abundance, yet the geometry of their wanderings had shifted. They walked in wide arcs, their paths consistently veering away from the center of the clearing. Even when they were miles away, the memory of that pulsing, metallic light seemed to bleed through the trees. Adam would pause, his hand resting on a trunk, and look back toward the heart of the forest. Hawa often mimicked the motion, her gaze lingering on the distant, shimmering foliage. The wind carried a different weight now, brushing against them with a persistent, quiet pressure. The garden was still vibrant, but the silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with a new, unspoken curiosity that made every shadow look deeper and every rustle of leaves sound like a question. They continued to walk, but the ease of their stride had vanished, replaced by a cautious, watchful tension that turned every step into a deliberate choice. The stillness of the afternoon was broken by a soft, dry, sliding sound overhead. Adam was distracted by the shifting patterns of light on the ground, leaving Hawa a few paces behind, near a thick, gnarled branch. A flicker of movement caught her eye. A slender creature descended, its scales catching the dappled sunlight like polished, multifaceted gems. It did not strike. Instead, it coiled around the branch with calculated grace, positioning itself inches from Hawa's shoulder. The garden seemed to hold its breath as the creature swayed, its head leveled with hers. The voice that emerged was not a hiss, but a sound like dry leaves rubbing together, smooth, articulate, and deeply insistent. "Why hide this wisdom?" the creature murmured, its eyes fixed on the distant pulsing glow of the central tree. It gestured toward the forbidden fruit with a slow, hypnotic movement of its neck. "First, the restriction is a shadow cast over your own potential. Taste it, and your eyes will be open to the truth of this world." The air around them seemed to thicken with the weight of the suggestion. Hawa stood motionless, the creature's words threading through the silence, turning her gaze away from the path forward and back toward the heart of the garden. Hawa stared at the glowing fruit, its light pulsing in rhythm with her own rapid, shallow breathing. The serpent remained coiled, its gaze heavy and expectant. She looked back at Adam, who stood a few paces away, his attention momentarily snagged by a falling leaf. The distance between them felt like a chasm. Hawa turned her attention back to the branch. Her fingers reached out, hovering in the air, before they made contact with the surface of the fruit. She felt a faint, humming vibration against her skin. Her hand trembled, a tremor that traveled from her wrist up to her shoulder. With a sudden, sharp motion, she plucked it. The connection to the branch snapped. She did not wait. She raised the fruit to her lips and took a deep, deliberate bite. The flesh was soft, yielding under her teeth. A stream of juice escaped, cold and vibrant, staining her lips with a deep, dark color that did not fade. The garden behind her seemed to shudder. She held the fruit, the remainder of it glowing in her palm, and felt the weight of her choice settle into her bones. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of her own heartbeat. Hawa turned to Adam, her hand extended, the fruit pulsating with a fading, unnatural rhythm. Adam watched the dark stain on her lips, then looked at the fruit. He did not ask. He took it from her, his fingers brushing the cool, smooth skin of the rind, and brought it to his mouth. He bit down. The flavor was sharp, metallic, and cold. As he swallowed, the world around them groaned. The vibrant green of the canopy above instantly bleached into a dull, lifeless gray. The golden light that had defined the afternoon vanished, replaced by a flat, diffused glare. The air, once soft and humid, turned brittle. A sudden, biting wind tore through the grove, snapping twigs and rattling the heavy leaves. It hit them with the force of a physical blow, stinging their exposed skin like thousands of tiny needles. Adam gasped, the sudden drop in temperature making his breath hitch in his throat. He looked at his hands, then at the forest floor, where the moss had already turned to hardened, cracked earth. The warmth of the garden was gone, replaced by a hollow, whistling draft that carried the scent of dust and coming winter. They stood frozen as the trees seemed to pull back, their branches reaching toward the sky in jagged, desperate lines. Adam looked down at his own frame, then at Hawa, his eyes darting across the now hostile clearing. The wind continued its assault, a relentless, icy current that made his skin crawl with a raw, unfamiliar sensitivity. He moved toward a nearby bush, his movements jerky and frantic. He grabbed at the thick, broad leaves, snapping the stems with a sharp, crisp sound. He pressed them against his torso, using the rough, waxy surface to shield himself from the biting draft. Hawa followed his lead, her fingers fumbling as she tore at the foliage, pinning the greenery to her own skin. They worked in silence, their breaths coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Every movement felt clumsy, the natural world suddenly becoming an obstacle. As they huddled together, the trees seemed to pull away, their branches retracting and twisting into jagged, skeletal shapes. The lush, welcoming canopy had vanished, replaced by a dark, looming ceiling that offered no shelter. The ground beneath them felt unyielding, the soft moss replaced by gritty, uneven soil that scraped against their feet. They stood in the center of the clearing, clutching the leaves to their bodies, but the garden remained indifferent to their efforts. The very air felt heavy with a sense of intrusion, a cold, sharp rejection that radiated from every trunk and stone. A sound vibrated through the marrow of their bones. It was not a whisper, but a heavy, resonant boom that seemed to originate from the sky itself. The voice was cold, stripped of its former warmth, and weighted with a finality that made the air feel thin. "You have disobeyed," the voice declared. The resonance rattled the remaining leaves on the branches until they snapped off and spiraled into the dust. Beneath their feet, the ground underwent a violent transformation. The soft, yielding soil hardened, turning into dry, compacted clay that cracked with a sharp, rhythmic sound as they tried to take a step. Every movement was now labored. The path ahead, once familiar and welcoming, narrowed into a jagged corridor of stone and withered vines. A relentless force seemed to push against their backs, compelling them to move forward. They stumbled, their feet scraping against the dry, parched earth. The garden was no longer a place of rest. It was a place of departure. They walked, shoulders hunched against the stinging wind, guided by the weight of the silence that followed the voice. Ahead, the horizon began to shift, the lush green horizon line dissolving into a wall of shadow. They moved toward the edge of their home, every step pulling them further from the life they had known. The massive iron gate loomed ahead, a jagged silhouette against the fading light of the garden. It stood as a final, immovable barrier, its surface cold and pitted with age. As they reached the threshold, the air grew unnaturally still. Adam and Hawa stepped across the boundary, their feet leaving the last of the soft earth behind. The moment their weight cleared the stone sill, the gate groaned. It swung inward with a heavy grinding sound of metal against rock. Then, it slammed shut. The thud echoed for several seconds, a final, percussive vibration that silenced the garden forever. They stood on the other side, trapped in a vast, empty expanse of gray dust and jagged stone. There was no green, no shade, only a flat, endless horizon that stretched toward a horizon of shifting ash. The wind here was different, sharp, biting, and devoid of life. It whipped against them, stinging their skin like needles. Adam reached out and gripped Hawa's hand, his fingers locking tight against her palm. They stood for a moment, letting the cold air settle into their lungs. Then, they stepped forward. They moved into the gray distance, leaving the silence of the garden behind to face the unyielding terrain of the unknown.